we're not used to hearing, especially about the nation of Israel. So again, just like I've done several times throughout this book of Romans, I just encourage you to keep an open mind and an open heart, and not resist the truth, but not twist the truth. So if we do that, we will hear something, if not all of it, we will hear something that God wants us to hear from this section. Okay? So that's where we're going to be, chapter 11. And the way I'd like to deal with it is I'd like to take a minute for us to read it together. And then I want to go back and kind of go through it at not a real deep level, but just at a little bit more than a reading level, and try to summarize the sections ourselves. Try to put it into our own words. Because it says a lot, this chapter does. And so if we can put it into our own words, maybe we'll begin to be able to process it better, understand it more, and see the flow of the argument. But let's, for just a minute, let's remember where we are. Chapters 9, 10, and 11. What is the topic? What is the theme or subject of chapters 9, 10, and 11? Yeah, that's a good stab. If in doubt, in the book of Romans, guess faith. What in particular? What has been the big question of chapters 9, 10, and 11?
Whether the Jews or the Hebrews, I guess, are going to be saved, or if they still God's chosen.
Yep. It really revolves around Israel, around the Jews, God's people. Their standing, and why were they presently outside of Christ, most of them, and what's going on in this whole situation. So chapter 9 had dealt with almost exclusively the sovereignty of God. That before we could even begin to process deep questions like, what is God doing here? First things we need to hear is that God is God, and He doesn't answer to us. And that's not our place to be able to say, God, you need to explain yourself to me. Now, very often He graciously and mercifully does explain Himself, but we never have the right or the authority to call God into question. So He really establishes that, because it just puts us on the right plane to begin to think about this. Chapter 10, while 9 dealt with God's sovereignty, chapter 10 really is dealing with man's response to God's sovereignty and to His gracious provisions. God had made it possible for Israel to believe, because He had sent out the message, just like the message of creation. It went everywhere. Their voice had been heard throughout all the earth. And so the problem in chapter 10 was not that God had made it too hard or inaccessible or too difficult for them. The problem was, as the prophet said, they just did not heed the message. So 9 was the sovereignty of God. 10 was man's response to God's grace and His gracious offer in Christ. I'm sorry, I can't talk and give you a paper job at the same time. I'm sorry. So chapter 11.
I'm sharing my phone.
So chapter 11 is going to talk about the blending of those two ideas. The blending of God's sovereignty with man's proper response to what God does. And He's going to do that in a discussion about a mystery. And when Paul talks about a mystery, it doesn't just mean, hey, this thing is too deep to comprehend, although a lot of chapter 11 is just that way. What it means is a mystery is, it used to be covered up and concealed, but now it's uncovered. Now it is made known. So it's no longer going to be a mystery, because now He's telling us what this mystery is. So before we get started in the reading of this chapter, I want to look at something with you. Look at chapter 11, and let's begin in verse 25, because I think this is the objective of the chapter. 11 verse 25 says, "For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." I think that's the objective of chapter 11, is to discuss with them, this mystery. But he has a purpose in discussing the mystery. Right there in that verse, what does he hope to accomplish with the Gentiles, the Gentile believers, by discussing this mystery? What does he hope is the impact or effect on them? Somebody said something?
They shouldn't be ignorant.
That they would certainly, first of all, wouldn't be ignorant.
He said the impact on the Gentiles.
Yes, on the Gentile believers.
So they won't be conceited or think themselves greater than the Israelite.
That's right. He wants to keep them humble about this whole thing. He'll say earlier in the chapter, he'll say, just because some branches were cut off to make room for you, don't be arrogant against the original branches of the olive tree. So his intention with the Gentile believers is to reveal the mystery, but in doing so, to help them really understand their place in God's family, in God's tree, in the figure, this olive tree, and in his kingdom. What does he hope to do by revealing this mystery among the Jews? Look back earlier in the chapter at verse 11. He said, "I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous." Verse 14, "If somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them." So in his discussion of this mystery, he wants to effect among the Gentile believers humility and an appreciation of what God has done to bring them in. But among his Jewish physical countrymen, he wants to do what? Make them jealous.
So their faith can be strengthened.
Mm-hmm. So that they can even come to faith, and so that they can be saved. So that's his dual hope here, is to do this with the Gentiles and effect this among the Jews by discussing this mystery. All right, so let's take a minute, read it together, and then we'll go back and see if we can't put some of these sections into our own words. Verse 1 says, "I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. For I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah? How he pleads with God against Israel. Lord, they have killed your prophets. They have torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life." But what is the divine response to him? "I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal." In the same way, then, there has also come to be at the present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. But if it's by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. What then? What Israel is seeking, it has not obtained. But those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. Just as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not, down to this very day. And David says, "Let their table become a snare and a trap, and a stumbling block, and a retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened to see not, and bend their backs forever." I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. Now, if their transgression is riches for the world, and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? But I'm speaking to you who are Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle of Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. If somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. For if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also. And if the root is holy, the branches are too. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them, and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. But if you're arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief. But you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Behold then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fail, severity. But to you, God's kindness, if you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. From the standpoint of the gospel, they're enemies for your sake. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you once were disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience, so these also now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they also may now be shown mercy. For God has shut up all in disobedience, so that he may show mercy to all. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways! For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who became his counselor? Or who has first given to him that it might be paid back to him again? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. Whew, that's a lot. So even just to read it is a lot, but to track that is hard. So it'll really help me tonight if you guys will just interact and ask questions and make comments and let us work through this together, because I don't think it's going to be helpful much at all for me just to lecture tonight. So it'll really, at least in my opinion, be better if we can interact. So what I want to do is go down through. I've broken it up into these sections. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sections. Let's talk about it a bit and then see if you can put a heading on it in your own words. All right, so going back to that first one, verses 1 through 6. What is the first question of verse 1? What is it that he wants to ask and then answer.
Has God rejected his people?
Has God rejected his people? That is the question. And his answer in no uncertain terms is what? Absolutely not. He has not rejected his people. So Paul says, because if that were true, what would have been Paul's condition? Lost, rejected, because he was an Israelite of the tribe of Benjamin, descendant of Abraham. So no, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. So if he has not rejected them, then what then is the point that he goes into next about this passage, 1 Kings 19, about Elijah? What does he want to prove there? That back in that day, when Israel numbered hundreds of thousands of people in that day, this is that northern tribe, which all of their days, most of them were unfaithful to God. The ones that never left the worship of those idols, always following after the Baals. There are hundreds of thousands of them. But in Elijah's day, when he thought that he was the only one left, that everybody has forsaken you, but I'm alone in all of this, what did God say to him? I really have what? 7,000 that have not bowed the knee to Baal. Now that sounds like a big number, and it is, but I think the point is it's 7,000 not compared to one. It's 7,000 compared to 1 million. In a nation of 1 million people that wore the name Israel, God said in that nation of, and I don't know an exact number, I'm just using 1 million for illustration purpose. It definitely was hundreds of thousands of people. Because when they went to war, they're bringing 500,000 warriors. So they're way over 1 million. They're a couple million people. So 7,000 is relatively what compared to that? Relatively small. And even at that time, God looked within the nation of 1 million plus people and said, really, the ones that belong to me are just these. Everybody got that? That's his point. So when he's talking now, asking the question, has God rejected his people? He's taking us back again to let God tell us, not just who the physical Jew is, not just what tribe you belong to, but letting God tell us who are his people. Just like in that day. He said, I've got 7,000. All the rest of these, they're worshiping Baal. Back in the 1 Kings 19, not only have they bowed the knee to Baal, but they've kissed the hand of Baal. They're giving their allegiance to Baal. They've not given their allegiance to God, to Jehovah God. Okay, so his point from that then is that in that same way, at this present time, when Paul was writing this letter, what did he say existed right then at that time? Verse 5.
A few of them have remained faithful.
A few of them. And most versions call them, those few, what? A remnant. According to God's gracious choice. So even right now, Paul says, there is a remnant. There is a portion. There are a few of them that are his right then. Everybody got that? So he's looking not back on Elijah's day. He's looking at his present day when Paul was living and saying, there's hundreds of thousands of physical Jews all around us. But God still has, even at that time, what? A remnant. And so this just let Paul tell us what he's talking about. Okay, but it's a gracious remnant. It's a remnant by his choice. And then, so if within the nation of Israel there was this remnant of people that still belong to God, what does verse 6 say? Or, excuse me, verse 5, there's this gracious remnant. Verse 6, if it's grace, it's no longer according to works. Verse 7, what does it add? That there was this chosen part, there was this gracious remnant. What happened to the rest in verse 7? They're hardened. And so we're talking about the rest of who? Who are we talking about? Rest of Israel, rest of the physical Jews. So God had a remnant. According to his gracious choice, all the rest of them were hardened. It's going to be tough. You guys are going to fall asleep on me if we don't interact with this, because it really takes some thinking to work through these things, to just kind of track it. There's so many they, them, us, we, that we get lost in some of this. But remember what he's talking about. He's talking about physical Israel, Jewish people, those kinsmen according to his flesh. He said right when Paul was living, there was a remnant, and then there was a whole lot of them who had been, what? Hardened. Okay, so if you were going to put in your own words on verses 1 through 6, what would you say 1 through 6 just said?
First, I gotta ask. So he mentions that which later, I guess, is when this comes up. That he's talking about this branch. You know, they kind of cut themselves off, is the way. But were they hardened so that they would do that to make room for Gentiles? And is that what that's implying?
You're getting way ahead of us, so I'm going to have to rein you in for just a minute and say, Jacob wants to know about, are you asking, did God harden them or did they harden themselves? Is that what you're asking them?
I mean, we keep coming back, and I'm doing a study on Calvinism, man, so we keep coming back to the same thing. It keeps coming up. It's like 3 weeks in a row. Where's Kevin, man? Come on.
Yeah. Well, again, once we get to the end, I think what we're going to see is that, remember 9, the sovereignty of God. Chapter 10, man has a response to it. Chapter 11 is both of those mingled together. I don't think it's either or. I think it's both of them working in complement. That God does things that he doesn't check with anybody else about, and just says, this is how it's going to be. And this is my gracious choice. This is my choice. But then there are things in which he says, if you want to participate in this stuff, I'm going to give you that opportunity by being able to believe and come to Christ for salvation. So I think it's a blending of both. And I think in just a minute, especially verses 16 and following, or 11 through 16 will help us see some of the other terms that are used parallel with this hardening. Okay, so what would you put on verses 1 through 6? What would you say that said? It asks a question. Did God reject his people? Answer, nope. But then what does the rest of it add? God still has a remnant. That's his. It's a gracious choice. Anybody want to give me a heading that they would put on that? But so far, that's what he's told us. He's not rejected his people. God had at that time a remnant according to his gracious choice. All right, so if that be the case, that God has not rejected his people, that he has a remnant by grace that belongs to him, what then is Israel's condition? The bulk of them, the rest of them. What do you say about the rest of them? If there's only just a remnant, just a partial, what about the rest of them? That becomes the question. So verses 7 down through verse 10 will begin to address some of those things. So then he will ask, what Israel is seeking, it has not obtained, but those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. So 2 groups, the chosen remnant and the hardened. And so what is their present condition? He's going to say about the bulk of them? Hardened. Without even substituting any other words, they were presently in a hardened state. Some versions might say blinded or hardened. But either way, it's talking about the not able to hear, not able to see, not able to comprehend and process properly all of this.
The wrong word to say there?
Not in a minute. It won't be. He'll fill that out in just a minute. But at the moment, he wants us to focus on they're in a hardened state right now, and that Paul says was supported by the prophets. The passages that he quotes are probably from Deuteronomy, it's hard to find an exact reference for the first part, the God giving them the spirit of stupor, because Isaiah says some things like that. Deuteronomy says some things like that. David's quotation, pretty sure that's Psalm 69. But the first one looks like it's almost a mosaic of passages that talked about this spirit of stupor and the people not being able to see or hear. So just like the prophets said, they right now are in this hardened condition. So what would you say? Your summary of 7 through 10, what would it be?
Well, it would be negative.
Thank you. I will take that. That is a. She said it'll be negative. Whatever he's talking about does sound good. It's not a compliment, is it? It's not a positive.
They're stuck in a wind cycle. It's like,
There's-
we see in the Old Testament, they're stuck in that cycle of something bad happens, they call out to God.
Mhm.
Liberates them, saves them. They go right back to, and it's over and over. So it's like, it's ungrateful. It's harder. It's all of it. It's all they're stuck in this.
I think
And it-
what I'm seeing is let their bountiful table become a snare, a trap, makes it, let their blessings cause them to stumble. It is letting them kind of dwell in their self-righteousness, to where maybe they count their blessings as, or count what they have as
Mhm.
blessings, but they're nothing but snare. They're not. They're from their own self-righteousness.
Well, that's good.
They're illusions or something.
Yeah.
Where they think they're blessed, but they're not.
Mm-hmm. And the very blessings have turned into these snares. Were you going to say something, Holly?
I do. I keep, and if I like randomly choke up, it's my hormones. So just.
We'll
Just like asking,
we'll absolutely understand. You choke up all you want.
I don't know. I just feel frustration because if you do, I know it's not an exact quote, but if you do go back to Isaiah 29 and look there, again, God is just so frustrated because they're not listening to Isaiah. It's the same old story about how his people, his nation, in that passage, they were called Ariel, which was a nickname that Israel had given to Jerusalem, meaning God's lion. This beautiful Ariel, God's lion of people. But they're not. And so he's frustrated, and then, it's like the Lord poured out on them a strong urge to sleep. He has shut the eyes, you prophets, and covered the heads of you seers, because the prophets and the seers, they were all turning pagan. And so God is so frustrated, and so that's how I feel, not that he hardened the hearts of the Jews, but that they were hardened. That they had, that's what's the part between free choice and sovereignty, because they should have known. They knew the law, they had the law, they were the people, they saw the history of the ups and downs, and they had been waiting on the Messiah, and he was here and fulfilled so many prophecies, and even was pointing them out, and they still wouldn't accept him. And so, God's like, your hearts can be hardened, it's like all of this for years, and here he is, and you're rejecting him. And so, it's like, their hearts are hardened, and using that reference from David, it's like, let your table become a snare. Let you fall, let you stay in the back bin forever. Like, be hard if you're going to be hard. Like, because he came and you rejected him. So, as long as you're going to reject him, you can just stay lost. Because salvation was there and you didn't take it. So I just feel frustration coming through and all of that.
You communicated that well. Thank you. You did.
That's
No.
how I feel. I feel mad for
Yeah,
God.
you're mad.
I didn't cry.
I like what.
And we see that to this day.
Mhm.
We see that there is no peace.
Mhm.
There is no peace in that part of the world,
Mhm.
even to this day.
That's right. And even what Kaushik was saying about being stuck in that cycle, what is the result of being stuck in that cycle? What does it do to you? It hardens you. It's not softening. It was not softening them. It was hardening them because they just did it over and over and over again. Okay, so what would you say verse verse 1 through 6, God has not rejected his people. He has this remnant. What's happened to the rest? They have been hardened. He does not explain to us yet at that point why or how the hardening has happened, just simply that they are hardened, is what he says. Okay, let's go a little further. Verses 11 through 16. What I'd like for you to think about here is that he's already told us that they've been hardened. Look at some other characteristics or statements about Israel that I'm not going to say it's synonymous with being hardened, but certainly it's running parallel with it. It's their condition even while they're hardened. So listen to it. Like verse 11, I say then they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. So they have stumbled. But by their transgression. So now, in addition to saying they're in this hardened condition and that they've stumbled, they also are in the midst of their what? Their trespass, their transgression, their sin. Because of that, salvation has come to the Gentiles. For their transgression is riches to the world. And then verse 12 says, and their failure. So we now have hardened, stumbling, transgression, failure, all being used to describe Israel. And then verse 15 says, for if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be? So just looking at an overall description of them, hardened, but stumbled. Why did they stumble? Back in chapter 9, it told us that God had sent him who is the stone of stumbling and rock of offense, and they stumbled over him. They've rejected Jesus. They've stumbled because they didn't put their faith in him. So they stumbled, and that has become their overwhelming transgression, is their rejection of Jesus, and it's their failure. And because of that, it has led to this rejected state. Okay, so I want to ask a question. In verse 11, when it says, I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall. What does that mean? What is he wanting us to think about when he says, okay, granted, Israel stumbled, but did they stumble so as to fall? What is he wanting us to think about?
They didn't go all the way down.
Did they go all the way down? Good point. Asking the question, did Israel go all the way down?
Is it permanent?
Is it permanent?
It's like no lack of redemption, though.
Are they? Is it
too far
irreversible?
gone?
Are they too far gone?
And
Yeah.
my translation reads different, and I was trying to figure out why, but mine says they did not stumble into an irrevocable fall.
New Living Translation says, did God's people stumble and fall beyond recovery?
Yeah. So those are he's wanting us to think about something here, right? It's granted that they've stumbled, but he wants to say, how serious is this stumble? Is it irreversible? Can they be brought back? Is it so far just in the figure that they're flat on their face and they'll never get back up again? That's what he wants us to think about in this at this point. So the stumbling, the hardening, absolutely true. But is it irreversible? Is it a hopeless situation? Are they too far gone? Have they done something by which they can never, ever be redeemed? And the answer to that will be no. So listen to how he addresses it here. He says, first of all, that's not the case. But how had God used their present hardening and their being in the midst of this transgression and stumbling? How had he used it? For the Gentiles. This is going back to why did we get told back in chapter 9 first, you better get ready for God doing some things that he doesn't explain to you. This is one of them. When he's saying to them, I used their hardening. Or if you want to say he caused their hardening. But I did it so that I could bring salvation to the Gentiles. We're like, whoa, what's that all about? But God says that's how he works. And he used it to not only bless the Gentiles, but to make them rich and to bring them into the family of God. And he used it, and it fulfilled his purposes.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Do you think that means, like their transgression, but by their transgression salvation has come? Do you think that means their transgression was obviously not accepting Christ and pushing to have him crucified, and his crucifixion obviously is salvation to all people. Is that what that means? Or just the fact that because my people won't receive me, I will, take in the Gomer. That Gomer didn't receive him either. But anyway, take in that extra fold because you rejected me. Now salvation has come to everybody. Is it that, or is it specifically talking about the crucifixion? Because I can't figure out what he means there. Or I guess it could be both.
I haven't really thought about trying to separate it from their transgression and putting Jesus to death versus their rejection. It seems like it's all, in my mind, all tied up together. That what they put him to death because they rejected him. And they presently, at the time he's writing, were still doing what? Still rejecting him. Still violently opposing everything he was about. Rounding up believers, putting them in prison, stoning them, having them killed. They were still violently opposed to Jesus. So I really don't know an answer to that except just to say in my mind I was seeing it all as part of their rejection. And that he used that rejection to open up the door. If you want a really good example of this, read Acts 13. When Paul was at the Antioch that was up in Pisidia, not the one that was in Syria, but the Pisidian Antioch, he spent the Sabbath there talking to all the people, and a whole lot of them were Jewish people. They asked him to come back the next Sabbath day, and he goes back the next Sabbath day. But now the Jews have gotten indignant and arrogant, and they're opposing what Paul's doing. And Paul says, all right, great. We had to come to you first, but since you repudiate it and you count yourselves unworthy, we're going to do what? We're going to turn to the Gentiles. Well, that is a living example of what he's talking about. Their hardness, their rejection, their transgression opened the door. And then what did the Gentiles do when Paul said that? They started rejoicing. It's like, yes, it's coming to us. And so you get a living example of what this looks like. Because if it had simply gone, in my mind, that God comes in, Jesus comes in, and then every Jew possible flocks to him, it is just going to look like what? It's going to just look like this Jewish church that is just a continuation of what we've seen for 2,000 years. Gentiles have no place. It's only for you guys. But when they are in this hardened state and they reject and they fight against it, what has it done? It has brought riches to the Gentiles. Because now, not only are the Gentiles coming in, they're so coming in that they're even borderline what? Arrogant about it. It's not like they're out there saying, we don't belong. We're so mean. They're thinking, what now? Hey, we're the ones. We're better than you. It's gone that far. But that's what led to this, was this hardening that he said God used to bring these riches to the Gentiles. So that's my take on it. And you guys you obviously have to process it your way. But I'd see it. I saw that whole thing just lived out in the book of Acts. This thing that he's talking about here, it is just over and over again. Every city that they went to, the formula was repeated. Where did they always go first? To the Jews. We had to come to you first, Paul said. And then
Acts 28 talks about when he's in Rome. The same sort of thing from Acts 13, it's just in Acts 28. It's in Rome.
It's another example of that same thing. That when they reject, when they stay in that hardened state, it opens up the door for the floodgates to be opened, for the Gentiles to come in. And Paul will use an expression for the fullness of the Gentiles to come in. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so they're in this hardened condition, but God is using it in a glorious, amazing, divine, supernatural kind of way that it opens up the door of blessing and salvation to the Gentiles. But even as he's talking about that, he says that they're in their transgression, they've stumbled, they have failed, they've been rejected, but he still holds out, like at the end of verse 12, he says, their failure is riches for the Gentiles, but how much more will their what be? Their fulfillment, their fullness. So he said, even I can tell you what they look like right now, but he said what? I can also see what? What they not only could be, but in Paul's words, what they're going to be. That's the thing that we have trouble accepting. Is Paul sees this as a whole lot more definite than we sometimes want to see it. We want to always leave it in the realm of so. He talks about the fullness of the Gentiles. He talks about the fullness of the Jews, and so they can be accepted. He's going to say in a minute, all Israel will be saved. That's a big statement. He's not talking with doubt there. He's making very, very definite statements. Not only that, there at verse 12, their fulfillment. He said if their rejection is reconciliation, verse 15, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? And so then verse 16, if the first piece of dough is holy, and like just the little piece that's in the lump, what is true of the rest of the lump? The whole thing is holy. And if the root of the tree is holy, what about the branches? They're holy too. And Israel came from holy stock. Right? They came from people that God said, I loved Abraham. Abraham is my friend. I will keep my covenant with Abraham forever. And so this is getting back into reflecting on, does God keep his promises? And he absolutely keeps his promises. So while they are in this hardened condition, verses 7 through 10, there is a purpose to it to bring salvation to the Gentiles, and there is still hope. Everybody working through this with me? Are you writing down some things that sort of put it in your own words as we go? Yes? Yes? All right, good. Thank you. So now verse 17. And there is hope. I don't know exactly why he chose the figure of the olive tree. It is a figure by which God speaks of his people. Jeremiah uses it. But it wasn't the predominant one. More predominant than the olive tree was the vineyard. It was the image of a vineyard that God cared for and that he cultivated and that he took care of, and that was his. Not to say that the olive tree was never used, it was. So I'm not sure exactly why the choice of that figure here. You'll read some people suggest things about what it meant and why it meant that, but I can't figure that out. So I'm just going to tell you it's a figure that God did use to speak of his people, and Paul sees it as very fitting here to talk about this grafting in. And basically, what's he going to say about this olive tree? That the unbelieving part of Israel had been what from the tree? They had been cut off. The believing part of the Gentiles who believed in Christ Jesus had been grafted in. And he says that really is pretty impressive because you guys came from what kind of stock? Wild as could be. You are uncultivated, wild stock. And he crafted you into this really cultivated tree. And the cultivation is God been working with that tree for thousands of years and refining it, cultivating it, really getting it hybrid to be what he wanted it to be. And then he takes this wild stock and says, hey, let's mix these two and see what comes of this. So you've been grafted in. So don't be arrogant. Don't get the mindset that, hey, branches were cut off to make room for us. Well, yes, they were cut off. But why were they cut off? Because of their unbelief. And they can be grafted back in if what? If they cease this unbelief. So, Jacob, when you asked the question earlier about this hardening and all of that, what we're going to see in this chapter is that there is a combination of divine action and human participation in it. They are in this state because of their unbelief. It wasn't done against their will. It wasn't forced upon them. They have been unbelieving. And because of that, this has been the result. So, the Gentiles, believers, should not be arrogant, but should be thinking, Paul said, wow, if God cut off the natural branches, the Jews who didn't believe, what's he going to do to me if I'm unbelieving? Same thing. So, beware. Be careful. Be cautious. Don't become arrogant in all of this. But appreciate the kindness of God and respond to His kindness with faithfulness and obedience to Him. Okay, so verses 17 and following down to verse 24, there is hope for Israel. It is not a fall that cannot be recovered, because verse 23, if they do not continue in their unbelief, they will be grafted in. So nothing Paul says about Israel's salvation or being brought back in is ever on any other terms than everybody else. They have to believe in Jesus Christ just like we did. He's not going to do something against their will. He's not going to make them believe and confess Him. It is still going to be they must not continue in their unbelief. And God will graft them back in again. All right, so verse 25. This is really the crux of the matter. It's this mystery that Paul wants to inform the brethren about so that they won't be wise. And he says that a partial hardening has happened to Israel. And those words are chosen carefully. It's not a complete hardening to where it's just like heart of stone that can't be touched. It's partial hardening that has happened in Israel. So again, we've never left the discussion that he's talking about physical Israel, his countrymen according to the flesh. A partial hardening has happened to Israel until what happens? Okay, so your version, Billy, read that for me, verse 25.
But you understand this mystery, dear brothers and sisters, that you will not feel proud about yourselves. Some of the people of Israel have hard hearts, but this will last only until the full number of Gentiles comes to Christ.
Okay, so full number, that verse said. What is that? Is that the NIV? NLT. Right. Mine just says the fullness of the Gentiles coming. It doesn't use the word number as if to stress that what we're talking about here is numerical. Because fullness it actually certainly can be used numerically. Say it's a full number, like there's a quota, that there is a specific number that has to be met, and then when that full number is met, it's full. But it can also just speak of the abundance. It's not the numerical point, but it is that the task was achieved. And so because of that, the fullness has been reached. The fullness has been accomplished. But this thing is directly connected to the fullness of the Gentiles coming in, or the full number of Gentiles coming in. All right, so that's where we'll pick up next week. But what I want you guys to think about is, I don't know what that looks like. I don't know a number. I don't know, did that happen back in Paul's day? Because if you think about it and say, no, that means it's going to happen until every single Gentile who was going to believe has had the chance to hear and believe, that is still going on today, right? Every day, everywhere, and it's going to go on till when? It can't end until Jesus comes back. And so, is it then? Are we looking at that point in time? Or is it? And so when people that believe that think, well, what that means is that it'll run up until that time, Jesus comes back, and then there's going to be something that happens that has this mass conversion to Jesus Christ. If that's how God wants to do it, I'm fine with that. I'm only going to rejoice anytime anybody is saved. But if they did that, if it was some future point, and it's that generation, what about all the Jewish people back here that didn't believe? What about them? I have trouble fitting all that in. So I'm going to give you my explanation of it. Come on in, Archie.
Again.
he's got things to do. So you guys come on. So I see it as a process, not as a single event that says, all right, we got them. We got the million Gentile believers. Now it's time to do it. I see it as happening over and over and over again. And my reference for this is just simply what happened in the New Testament, just like we read a minute ago. Every place they went, they would always encounter a portion of a Jewish population. And in that portion of that Jewish population, there were these two groups. What two groups did we read about tonight? We read about God's remnant, and we read about the hardened. They faced that everywhere they went. There would be those Jewish people who were part of that remnant, who he had already described as being Jews, who weren't circumcised just in the flesh, but circumcised in heart, who belonged to true Israel. They responded in faith. They came to Jesus Christ, but then there would be a large population of Jews that were what? Hardened. That opened the door to the Gentiles to be brought in for the fullness of the Gentiles to come in. And so he was saying that, in my understanding of it, that was going to continue until everyone had heard, everyone had been reached, and the fullness of the Gentiles had come in. That's my understanding of it. Does not at all mean that it's not what somebody else would tell you. Nope, that's a future event. When every single Gentile believer has been rounded up, then God's going to do something with the nation to have all Israel saved. You can think about that. What I want you to think about, though, is this, and I will stop after this. When he says all Israel is saved, I want you to go back and think about how he has used the word all in Romans. When he says all have sinned, what does that mean? It means every single person. No exception except one. All have sinned. But there are times in Romans when he will say all. He will say to them, brothers, sisters, I don't have to tell you anything because you have all knowledge. What do you think he means by that? You think they knew every single thing that could be known? You all are kind of hesitant about that. No. They didn't know anything about pi r squared. Or they had the knowledge that God wanted them to have. And for Paul to say, all the churches greet you, does he mean that every church possibly holds? He's just talking about the ones he's working with. Or if Paul was to say that your faith has been proclaimed to all, you think he means people in the Americas, in the Asian countries, Japan, China, India? No, he just means what? In this known world where I've been operating, everybody knows about you. So I'm just saying to you, when you hear all, we automatically say all's all. That means everybody, every single person, every single thing. Sometimes it's used accommodatively. All is. And already God has been honing our definition of this throughout Romans. So we'll talk more about that next week. We'll break into some groups and get to discuss and talk and figure all this out. Thank you, guys.